my voice and use this. Is it on? Can you hear me? Oh, mekai. Again, aloha aiai kako pakahi apau. And greetings to each and every one of you. My name is Auli'i Mitchell. I'm the cousin of Maile Meyer here. Our Tutuwahi Nikuakahis are sisters, and I teach over here at Ho'okupu, this beautiful place to hold hula and the practices of hula. So cousin asked me to come in and open a little bit with a little bit about vai, and then also with an oli to get everyone started. You know, maybe about 4 months ago, one of our kupuna said, hey, let's look at vai, water, differently. Let's makavalu, or look deeper into that word. Let's bring out the dictionaries, and let's go into the depth of this word. And then, why do we say, oh, wai, oi? Who you? Instead of, what is your name? But, oh, wai, oi. And so, we all began to dive into the different dictionaries we had and all of our tacit knowledge passed down to us from generation to generation. And we began to go into the words. And then for me, what I found was that one interpretation talked about vai o wahine, the moon cycle of the woman. Then I found waiokani, which is those little swimmers, the male sperm, actually. I thought, wow, vai, we always think of the word, when we say it twice, as wealth. But there's wealth in the male and the female. And so they have to noho pulaua. They have to stay together, the waiowahine and the waiokani, to create life. And so for me, I found, wow, I'm vaiokamo'o. I'm waters of succession. And so that made me feel, wow, to the physical, I know there's water in me. We all know there's there. But you know, the spiritual aspect of that word, when you dive in deeper to it, we find like those birthed through the waiokani and the waiowahine, us, kalahui Hawaii, the nation, thus has a soul. So I found vai has a soul. And the chant I came in with, ku kulu o puakai, means the clouds that parade along this ma'alihilani, this horizon. And they fill up with water, with vai from a mythical lake we call Kulani Hakoi. And when the lake fills up with water, it elo o lalo I ka vai o Kulani Hakoi. It drenches the lands below with 3 different kinds of rain. And the first rain is known as kulu kulu. You hear it all the time. Drip, 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 drip rain. Then the other one we learn is haveve, which is, you know, when you're working in the aina and the rain is coming from far and you run for get inside the house, that's the haveve, going to come and going to go. And then the third one is loku, which is a torrential rain that just hits us hard and floods everything out. But with all of that water, a seed has been planted somewhere. Thus that seed then goes to ikupu, o mu'o maila, a sprout. The mu'o o laula maila, then the sprout turns to the mu'o, which holds the leaf. Then the lau comes from the leaf. And then from the lau comes the lala, the branch from that plant. And then the branch turns into the kumu. Our word for tree, our word for source, our word for vai. It's all connected. That's all that comes from above is right around here where we see in the kai, the sea. So I just wanted to share that with you. It's something I found, something I learned through the question of one of our kupuna. So I'm so thankful to share that with you. So Maile, let's gather outside and we will share words with Kani. Kani, the God of all living things and sacred of water. Come, we go.
Aloha mai kako. Mahalo nui kumo alui. Thank you so much for calling attention to everything around us, the vai around us, and for calling our attention to everything that we may not see that was present and is now maybe covered over with the cement walkways that we see, and Waikiki moving to Diamond Head. And I think that distance between what you pointed out and some of what we see today is what we need to talk about today. The way that development, the way that concrete and oil has transformed the environment is how we need to bring attention to new issues of climate justice. So before I start, I just want to thank so many people for bringing us together today. First of all, I want to thank Pu'u for all of his efforts in organizing the food, and the youth who have worked on the aina for the food and are going to serve for us after the first talk. I want to thank Pu'u Honua Society and Terasaki Foundation for their help and support in making this space available to us. They have put so much effort into this, and I want to thank especially Miley Meyer for all of her help today. And Josh as well. Josh, I have been calling upon Josh for so much help lately, and Josh is always right there, willing to do everything, and and I hope to return that gesture someday soon. So thank you both so much. It takes care and community to do this, and that's really what we're talking about today, is how we can revive care-community relationship to repair, heal the environment and community together. So we're gonna have two panels, and those panels, the first panel is going to be more about the politics, the economics, the legal side of climate justice. And the second panel will be more about ethics, values, emotions. And I hope folks can stay for both panels. We're gonna have some food, share some food and space in between. But both of those panels are really guided by water, by vai. And I've called this event today Water Talks because I wanted to also, as Ali'i spoke so eloquently about, I wanted water to be at the table. I wanted water to be a presence and an agency, a force that's with not just surrounding us, but inside of us, and that connects us all together. And so that is really where the healing energy is, so we need to surround ourselves with that while we also talk about very difficult issues. One of the things that's really important to recognize when we talk about climate justice is that we're talking about climate change not just as a scientific problem and a technical problem, we're also talking about climate change as a political problem and an economic problem and a cultural problem. And really, really deep-seated value shifts that need to happen in order to sustain the kinds of solutions that everyone can take part in. And so I'm hoping that we can begin that conversation today. And the water talks are really about justice. The first panel is really about the justice issues arising from water's displacement, but also all of the histories of displacement that have made communities vulnerable to climate change as well. And so this first panel, I really wanted to talk about issues of displacement, and so it's called moving stories so that we can really talk about what moving means, and we can also be moved by the stories that the panel shares. And so I've invited this amazing cohort, this jovial cohort up here in the front to lead us in that discussion. I've invited James Viernes to lead that discussion, and James is the Outreach Director of Pacific Island Studies and a Chamorro historian, and he's going to lead these wonderful people together in this discussion. So thank you, James.
Thank you, Jaimey, and thank you all for joining us for this discussion. I just want to reiterate the mahalo, the thank yous from Jaimey to our kumu here, our kupuna, who maintain this facility, for welcoming us into this space. And we hope that the stories that we've come to share with you will open a broader discussion on some of the issues of not only climate justice and the difficult and painful issues that climate change is bringing to our islands and our regions, but also the stories of triumph and agency and justice. Again, my name is James. I'm from the Center for Pacific Island Studies, and I've been given the honor of facilitating this discussion. We have 4 very distinguished leaders, community people, artists, poets, they're everything all wrapped in one. And we're very happy to have them here. I came with very nice notes of bios that I had researched for all of them to introduce them. And on the way over here, I realized how stupid that is, because each of these people up here have reputations that precede them. And also, I don't think I can do justice to all the wonderful work that they do. So I would like to actually turn it over to each of you to introduce yourselves, and then we can get into the broader discussion that we're here to have, okay? So I think maybe we'll start with Kathy, if you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work, please.
Okay. My name is Kathy Jadunukutinar. I'm from the Marshall Islands. I'm a poet and a performer, and sort of an artist as well. But not really, like kind of more poet. But I also am the founder of a nonprofit based in the Marshall Islands called Jochigum, which works with youth and youth on climate change and environmentalism. And I am currently climate envoy for our government as well. That's the new position. Yeah.
Thanks, Captain. Charles, here we go.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Charles. I'm from Singapore. I'm an artist now, but I used to sail a lot actually. And I've done a series of works called Sea State, which basically looks at Singapore's relationship with the sea. So currently I'm working on that, and it's coming to, and I've been working on it for I think about almost like 10 years. So currently I'm working on another series of works actually. It's called Shallow and Blood Heat actually. And it's also about the region actually. Yeah.
Aloha mai kako. My name is Joy Lehonani Namoto. I think of myself as a general troublemaker. I do a lot of things, but when I think about my art practice, it really took off into the direction of climate change around 2013, 2014. But before that, when I think about my relationship to water, I've always worked in issues of water. Before that, I was very kind of obsessed with the Atlantic slave trade and the Middle Passage. And so displacement and water is something that I've worked on for probably over 20 years. And I'm an archivist, and so I'm always thinking about time and how we measure time and preserve time and whose histories get saved. And so when I think about my work, it's always through the lens of an archivist. That's pretty much it.
tough day. My name is Julian Uggan. I'm from Guam. I'm an indigenous Chamorro person from Guam. I am the founder of Blue Ocean Law, which is a Guam-based law practice, but we work really throughout Oceania to try to advance the rights of indigenous peoples in several countries. We work on a range of human rights and environmental legal issues. We are in litigation, but we also are a team of law scholars as well, and we are trying to push the law in certain directions, essentially to maximize the legal protections for indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And I enter this discussion not necessarily from an artist's position. I don't consider myself artistically talented at all. I come at this as a historian that deals, I'm also from Guam, like Julian, and a lot of my research has dealt with my grandparents and their displacement from their coastal village by the United States military to facilitate the construction of present-day naval base on Guam. And so as a historian, I've come to think of this notion of moving stories or the movement of people, the displacement of people, the displacement of water as part of genealogies, larger genealogies of movement, larger genealogies of stories of movement. And again, movements that are associated with trauma, but again, also triumph. So I wanted to see if we could turn it over to our speakers to talk about some of the genealogies of movement and displacement that you may be seeing yourself coming out of and how you're using your work, whether as a poet, as a sailor, as a lawyer, as a photographer, to continue those stories and genealogies. That makes sense. Who wants to start?
They handed me the mic, so I guess I'll start. I guess when I think of movement, I think of diaspora. I think of my own experiences of being Marshallese and growing up in Hawaii, and so a lot of my what has informed my thinking in terms of climate migration is influenced by my experiences of being raised out here, really, and also connecting with a lot of the Marshallese who grow up in the U.S. as well. You know, when we talk about climate justice and climate change and what's going to happen, a lot of the discussions revolve around migration. Where are these people going to go? And so, you know, I've had that kind of talk with my students and with, you know, community members, and a lot of times it's always, well, yeah, of course, the U.S., you know, because that's our relationship. That's what our colonial relationship, I mean, our relationship right now is with the United States through our Compact of Free Association. And whether or not that's going to get renewed, it's looking like it likely will be renewed, actually. You know, this treaty with the U.S. allows us free entry. And yet we're also experiencing these kinds of like harsh realities of growing up out here where, you know, as we all know, there is that tension between Micronesians and the local population of Hawaii. And that's the kind of tension that I worry about for our people should we lose our homeland. And so that informs a lot of what the direction of our climate justice fights, which is basically just that we shouldn't have to move, we shouldn't have to leave. You know, if people want to migrate, it should be a choice, basically. And that's something that we've tried to make clear over and over at these climate conferences, at the Conference of the Parties, the COP, in these international spaces, is that migration for us should never be forced. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of what informs a lot of my positions as far as climate change goes, where, you know, quite a few people have already said we should just give up and go, but you know, we're not sticking to that. I guess when I think about, you said our art and practice or poetry, I do write a lot about climate change, and I've also written about, you know, I just wrote a poem for the installation that deals with religion, and also a recent experience of being detained at the LA, at LA on my way in from the climate conference. I got detained and they were like, oh, it's because you were detained years ago for trying to bring in clams from the Marshalls. And they were like, is these clams from like the sea? Like it was So anyways, I have a line about it in my poem. And that's how, so I bring these like real life experiences into my poetry, and I try to weave in all these kinds of intricate layers of how they connect, of being diaspora, of being diaspora yet rooted in the land, and yet understanding, how important sovereignty is to our country and to our identity. So I guess I'll just end there. I know.
What? Okay, I'll just go. We're all very polite here. I'll just actually start, I'll just sort of jump off what Kathy talked about. Blue Ocean Law, one of our main actual countries that we worked with as a firm is the Republic of the Marshall Islands. We have worked with the RMI for years to help the country diversify basically their legal strategies in the broader pursuit of redress. And so I'll talk about that really briefly, but I actually first want to start with this notion of climate migration. It's a conversation that always happens, every time we're in Madro, every time in the RMI. And it reminds me of something that I just came across, I think day before yesterday. I'm going off on a tangent, but I swear it's relevant. So I think 2 days ago I saw a story about the Australian fires, and it was just a quick story about, there was a line about koalas being in danger, right? Calling koalas functionally extinct. And then there was sort of an outcry immediately after, and people said, no, this is hyperbole. We shouldn't say this because it's actually unhelpful. Even in the climate movement, because functionally extinct, I guess it's a term of art. I'm not a scientist, but I think functional extinction refers to basically when a population, like the koalas, have been pushed past a point of no return. And there's almost this super quick, almost instantaneous kind of concession of space. Not that we need to fight hard as hell for a planet that koalas can live on, but just be ready yourselves spiritually at some level for this species to go out, to go quietly into the night. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that happens every time I'm in the RMI, this conversation when outsiders, especially outside researchers, are coming. People get funded. Oh my God, the amount of academic people that we, that come to fly to Madro with a pre-scripted story in their head, or journalists from all over the world. They're like, oh, y'all going out, And so they've already sort of diagnosed the problem. They have they're a doctor, right? They understand the harm and they already have the cure, right? They're ready to prescribe. And so the global climate finance system is also like this. This idea of climate and migration being inevitable. The idea that koalas are functionally extinct. Not stop, they're not functionally extinct. They're in danger, they're vulnerable, but we need to fight hard as hell for them to have a homeland, right? This is the same, I think, notion that I have when I'm in conversations, from legal arguments about the drafting of specific words in a clause in a treaty, to basically the climate finance negotiations. They're the same. It's this idea that we're already going to concede a certain space. We're already saying that it's inevitable, that the Marshallese people will have to move. And there's barely any discussion about adaptation in place, right? In situ adaptation, for example, right? There's so much discussion in the first world, and you should hear the conversations coming out of several European countries. Oh, there's never a conversation. Oh, it's so expensive. It's too expensive to adapt in place. Let's focus on moving. No, but because the Pacific, uniquely, almost singularly, I would say, as a region, has always been sort of conceived in this peripheral way. The Pacific and, her people, the islands and peoples of the Pacific, and we can see this going so far back in time from the Cold War era and the nuclear testing program of the Marshall Islands, when Henry Kissinger once said, there are only 90,000 people out there, who gives a damn? This, in callous reference to the just small amount of human beings that live in the Marshall Islands, and therefore it would be okay to drop 67 atomic weapons on the people of the Marshall Islands, right? Things that feel morally outrageous, and they would be morally outrageous in other places, are all of a sudden deemed cool when it comes to the Pacific region. And it's precisely because of that sort of dominant colonial narrative of viewing the islands as peripheral and dispensable. This is a dispensable portion of the human race. This is a dispensable region of the earth. That is exactly the problem. It has always been the problem. And we contest at our firm, we contest that narrative at every single level. So we are like actively, sorry, this is really bad. Are you okay? Yeah, it's kind of funny. Sorry. So we are actively contesting narratives. I'll just give you some examples. Do I have time? We're good? Okay, I'll wrap it up, guys. Okay, so we're like constantly interrupting this narrative. I'll give you one example, and that is this new extractive industry called deep sea mining. I'm not sure how many people are aware, but it's being called the new global gold rush. And so essentially countries and corporations around the world are scrambling to mine the hydrothermal vents and along the benthic, so the deep ocean and the seafloor itself. And they're going to mine it for rare earth minerals and metals like nickel, manganese, copper, cobalt, everything, right? And there's a supposedly staggering amount of mineral wealth located on the bottom of the sea. It so happens that most of those minerals are located in the Pacific. I'll give you one example. The International Seabed Authority based in Jamaica, which was the body established under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, basically has issued, since 2001, it has issued 29 deep sea mining exploratory licenses. 23 of those are based in the Pacific. Why? Because it's basically along our islands in the Pacific Ring of Fire, as it's called, where so much of this mineral wealth is concentrated. So here we are right now in 2019, and indigenous Pacific, 2020 now, so indigenous islanders along the coast of several Pacific island nations are bracing themselves for the largest mining operation in history. Right? This massive sort of scrambling and basically extraction of these minerals from the sea floor. And there's been a bevy of sort of negative adverse impacts, right, on several communities. And a lot of people in the industry, they're saying, oh no, because the mining is happening so far afield, it's happening all the way out there in international waters, it won't actually have an impact on the indigenous peoples or on any of the communities in these countries. So we've been contesting that narrative and saying, no, actually there's proof. There's proof right now that even in the pre-mining exploratory phase in Papua New Guinea, that it's already having sort of a gigantic effect on the indigenous Pacific communities off the New Ireland coast in PNG. For example, we worked for the last 6 years probably with communities on the ground, and reports came in and we detailed them, we wrote law articles, and we helped the communities do a massive moratorium. And so we've been pretty successful. Part of it is telling a better story, right? Part of it is part of our job as people are contesting this dominant narrative, right? Oh, no harm, no foul, this is a low risk, lucrative venture. No, it's not. And contesting it, but really contesting it with stories of harm, so for example in PNG, the one example that really moved me was in these villages off the New Ireland coast, New Britain Island, communities were reporting a lack of sharks. So basically communities on the ground had noticed that sharks were leaving from their traditional sort of calling grounds, right? And so what we quickly learned after being on the ground was that basically the ancient cultural practice of shark calling was actually in danger. And basically this is a practice whereby Papua New Guinean men, young boys, would go out to sea and they would lure through incantation and a bamboo-like coconut instrument. They would lure sharks from the deep water and they would catch them by hand. And this is basically a practice that has stretched back several millennia. And now, fishermen in this village are distressed. They're distressed because they're already having a hard time. The excessive levels of noise and dust from the Canadian company's operations have already sort of disturbed the sharks in their natural calling grounds to such an extent that they're not able to catch these sharks. And what that means from a human rights perspective is this is when these rights that exist in international should apply, free, prior, and informed consent. These sort of legal protections that are theoretically out there to help indigenous communities, because this basically is a cultural practice, but it's a quintessential rite of passage for young people in these villages when boys transition into manhood. So this is a hugely problematic thing, and so we are trying to find stories from the region and trying to lift up community voices, working with them to sort of amplify their voices and sort of object and say, no, this is not a low-risk venture. Maybe low risk for your Canadian company, but not for people in the community. but we've been fighting it, and this is just one example of contesting these narratives. And now the community has been really empowered, and we have driven even the value of Nautilus minerals stock so far down through everyone's sort of collective efforts. I think he one time was trading at $4.45 a share, and now it's at a penny a share, according to the last report. So we are sort of like doing good. This is one example. Like it's horrible, but it's also a success story to some extent of the sort of basically the result of really bottom-up grassroots like activism. And yeah, that's the work that we try to do.
How am I supposed to follow that? I'm supposed to follow that. Okay, that was a lot of information. It's actually, I'm actually glad you mentioned deep sea mining, because in 2015 I did an entire series on deep sea mining based on the Nautilus Corporation, which is now bankrupt. And at that time, I think in the very beginning, Nautilus Corporation, which then branched off into Deep Green Resources, because the CEO could see the writing on the wall and kind of started splitting the corporation and jumping ship really early on. But I ran with this idea of the Nautilus. Now in PNG, the Nautilus, the shell, the Nautilus is the oldest, cephalopod in the world. It's over, I think it's over 1 million years old. It is the oldest. It goes back, it is in the beginning of time, there is the Nautilus. And in fact, we should really, we don't really, if you really want to talk about beginning of time, you just go and you just start looking for Nautilus, right? And I imagined the Nautilus coming and basically crushing the Nautilus Mining Company. Deep sea mining, when you think about it, it is for us as Hawaiians, po is where we come from. And you're telling us that you want to carve out the beginning of us so that you can have copper in your cell phone, right? Or so you can have whatever you need to have in your computer. I could really give up my laptop right now if that meant you're not going to deep sea mine, right? You are at this constant frontierism is constantly putting us in this place of considering displacement. They're not displacing themselves. They live in Canada, right? There's countries all over the world invested in what's going on in the Pacific. It takes 1 million years for those minerals to grow. Now, I don't know about you, I don't have another 1 million years, I'm not gonna be here for another 1 million years, right? And so I have been obsessed with these industrial practices, and I always think about when you make your mistake, when these companies make your mistake, what's going to replace that, right? I don't know if a lot of you remember when there was the molasses leak in 2013. There was a ship over here actually right over here that leaked molasses for a year, and all of the fish died in the harbor. They were coming up for oxygen. Do you remember that? This was 2013. And ironically, the Honolulu Harbor is considered a protected area. It's a conservation zone. I think the levels of irony there are just beyond my scope. But you had fish dying right here from just molasses because it took the oxygen out of the water, right? But when you lose that oxygen, when you lose those fish, what replaces it, right? We've seen these large jellyfish blooms happening around the world. And I love jellyfish, but jellyfish blooms, like giant, massive jellyfish blooms, those are also telling us something about what's changing in the sea. So when we, and in this piece that I did with Kathy in this installation, when I'm thinking, we're thinking about whales, the ways that humans, particularly industrial bodies and military bodies, come in without any checks, without any balances, except for us on the ground doing this grassroots stuff, right? if you say don't do sonar, they'll say, well, this is a matter of national security. Millions of miles of ocean really don't need your sonar everywhere, right? And so when you've got this, there's this, the military is allowed ridiculous levels of take of marine mammals. It was actually asking for a take allowance of 1 million marine mammals for sonar. And so that's why there's lawsuits. That's why there are these lawsuits. And even the courts were like, really? Right? That's why NOAA, who's supposed to be, the first thing they'll want to do, rather than allow our Hawaiian practitioners to allow our whales to go back to Po to die naturally, so that they can go to the bottom of the sea, so they can start new life, so that it can become part of the cycle. They'd rather put us in jail. They'd rather arrest our Hawaiian practitioners for doing that than allow those natural practices to happen, right? Then allow for us to do what we have always done. And what's interesting is that when we're like, okay, you've arrested us, let's take it to court, then they're like, oh, actually, we're going to drop that lawsuit. Because they don't want us to bring that to the court of opinion, right? But they're like, let's cut open the brain so that we can find out what happened. Well, we know repeatedly what the role is of the Navy. We know repeatedly the role of plastic. We know repeatedly these things. So on the one hand, that's fine, but allow us to do the things that we need to do as well, right? It's not so much to conflict with science. If you need to euthanize, fine, but let us do the things that we need to do as well, and as people of this place, of people tied from the water. We are from the water. We belong to the water. We are made of water, right? So when I think about displacement, and it's really interesting, you talk about the koalas, or you see all these images of the kangaroos hugging, and people are just, a million, was it 1 billion animals in Australia? And I was thinking about that in juxtaposition with nuclear testing and the goats that were on the boat. And people will get way, way, way more upset over the thought of 1 billion animals dying, or the thought of a koala bear not existing, than they will over a child in a cage, or children being forced to leave their islands because of nuclear testing. And that's not just the West, that's us too. Right? I get into fights with Hawaiians all the time about this particular issue, right? About how we could be a pu'uhonua for people, right? But instead we're like, we have too much. You can't be here. I don't care that, I literally have heard Hawaiians say, I don't care that your islands were vaporized. And that is not who we are as a people. And so what I really think that the work that I really do is try to work towards opening that conversation up again and changing how we approach this. We can reach to each other and work with each other and support each other, right? My kuleana to Hawaiian, to my own people, that's a given. But what is my kuleana to the rest of the Pacific as a Pacific person? That is the question that I ask, that I want us to ask all the time, right? If you live here, what is your kuleana to the rest of the Pacific? We are not a pass-through. We are not a military base. We are a long and important and significant people. And the reason that you all come here is because our resources are so rich, right? And our cultures are so rich. And so then what is that kuleana, right? We've had the answer to climate change, but it takes disaster. It takes absolute disaster for people to go, oh, maybe those indigenous people had something. Maybe we should go back to that, right? I think that's cute. It's a little late, but I'm glad you guys are finally coming around. It's exciting. But anyway, on that note, I'll hand it off to my friend. You want to go to Charles?
Yeah, I think the three of you so far have given us a lot to think about as far as the core issues and the challenges in a Pacific context. And the three of you and I coming from the U.S. affiliated Pacific, that's not a term I really like because I think it's sterile, but the U.S. affiliated Pacific, we're very familiar with those issues. I'm wondering, Charles, if you can share with us what's at the fore right now in the places in which you're rooted, whether Singapore or other places that you can add to this discussion, and how is your work kind of?
Yeah, I'm from Singapore, but we have a US base also. Yeah. I think the base was initially in Philippines, and then I think at some point in time, the Filipinos were protesting against the base in the US base in the Philippines, and then that base actually moved to Singapore. What I can talk about Singapore is that actually in Singapore, when you talk to a Singaporean, actually they're very disconnected from the sea. They don't really know that they're on an island actually. But what's really surprising is that if you go to the Riau Islands, and which is actually Indonesia, but actually it used to be, culturally we are connected to them, but because of colonization, we kind of got cut out, we kind of got disconnected from them because of the Dutch and the British and all the complicated stuff. But anyway, the people there are Malay also, they're kind of connected to us in Singapore and Johor. And if you go to those islands, and you'll see that people actually live in houses that are actually in the sea, in the water. And to the Malays actually, when they say a country, it actually includes the water. The water is actually a nation to them. The water is actually a cultural, territorial space. It's not a sublime space where, like, you think about your death and you think about God. It's actually a real, practical space where people go and live and they work and things happen, and that's where they get their food, and that's how they communicate, in the water actually. And my project actually in Sea State, what I was trying to do was to flip that notion of territorial space, to see the water, to force the idea that the water is a space where our histories also exist actually. And it was initially it was kind of a kind of like thought experiment, but slowly as I did more research, actually I found out, actually really it was a real site actually. And in a sense, to the Malays, the land was actually more like the sea to them. Because the land was like very, they didn't know how to, they didn't really cultivate the land there because it was clay. It was, they didn't do farming. They were mainly a fishing community actually. So what's happened is that actually in Singapore, you can pull up the other image. Actually in Singapore, what happened was that there was this map, and when Singapore became independent, initially, the British were doing all the hydrographical maps in Singapore. And then in the 60s, when Singapore became independent, they started doing their own hydrographical mappings, actually. And then I did an interview with this guy called Captain Wilson Chua. He was Singapore's first hydrographer. And then when he was like, and he came out with this chart, actually, this nautical chart. And he was very proud that he came out with this system. He actually said it. It's not really me. He said, I came out with this grid system for the sea. And I was like thinking, a grid is a very old idea. But I just went along with it. And then actually, he actually came out with these grids in the 70s in the sea. And basically what he did was that he put kind of like A, B, C numbers next to it. And basically what he did was that he transformed the sea into a parking lot. Basically it's for the ships when they come into Singapore, the port. They'll tell them, okay, come there, go to A1, and then they go there and they park. And that's what happened actually. And in a way, the sea became like, when he did this gridding system, it became like the stories kind of like just got kind of like taken away from those areas. So we identify the sea not through names of the islands and the sites actually, but through this grid system. And then what happened was that this system was made in Singapore in the 70s. And this was the point in time when we did our land reclamation in Singapore. We started doing a lot of land reclamation. Singapore has expanded more than 30% of its original size through dumping sand in the sea and making our land bigger. And then we can move on to the next one. And what I did was that actually, I did a very simple gesture. I took the grids, the parts that he gridded, and I kind of like separated it from the parts that were not gridded. And what's really interesting is that when the grid system happened in the 70s, actually he gridded areas that were in the sea. But what happened was that we have expanded so much that actually, you can see on the map, actually there are areas in Singapore that actually, there's land, but there's grid behind them. And actually that's, in a sense, that's a residue of where the sea was actually. So that area used to be sea, but now it's land. But what's really interesting is that when we reclaim this land, there's a very different kind of status to this land. It's kind of like devoid of its histories in a sense. And recently I was actually invited to this show called in Barcelona. It was called The End of the World. You know, in Europe they have this anxiety of like the world's going to end because, you know, climate change and all sorts of things. And then there was this writer, actually his name is Timothy Morton. I think he's quite famous. He's from England, but now he's like, I think it's in the University of Houston. So I was like staying with him. And he came out with this term called hyper-objects. And he saw, like, you know, Singapore uses sand to reclaim, to make ourselves bigger. And he kind of saw that, you know, the sand that we were using as a hyper-object. You know, it's got no status. It's like styrofoam. You know, you dump it in, and it can be anything you want it to be, actually. And one other story I can tell you is that actually, I used to live in a fishing village called Mata Ikan, and I grew up with my grandmother, and she took seashells and she'd burn it, and she'd make paint out of it. And she'd mix it with water, you know. So I was living from that kind of community, actually. And there are many people living on the islands in Singapore, on the southern islands. And in fact, there was actually a minister that represented, it was actually a kind of like a, what do you call it, a county, or what do you call it in the US. It had representation, actually, the people that live in the island. But what happened was that in the 70s, at the same time with reclamation, all those people in Singapore, actually, we got moved right into the center of Singapore. So you can see, in a sense, you know, the map on the right side, that's where all the Singaporeans, the people that are Singaporean, actually got moved into. And that's what keeps Singapore sovereign, actually, in a sense. We are all in the center, and we're kind of been disconnected from water, actually. And what's happening with the reclaimed land that we have, in a way, I call that the nation state. And then the other part is called the sea state, because that's a part that we have reclaimed, actually. And what's happened in the sea state is that it's where our banks are, it's where we have workers from Bangladesh, immigrant labor, disposable labor. We put them, they're living there. The military is there. The corporation is there. So in a sense, you know, it's like the life, normal life is very disconnected from coastline now in Singapore. And then the other thing that was really interesting, actually, when I was talking to the hydrographer, he was actually looking at this island in Singapore. And this island used to be called Pulau Belakang Mati. In Singapore, actually, we have many islands with negative connotations. You know, we have Ghost Island, 2 Ghost Islands, and then we have one island called Pulau Sejahat, which means evil. We have an evil island. And then we have this island called Pulau Belakang Mati, and Belakang Mati means death behind. And what happened in Singapore in the 60s, you know, we became a modern state. So we can't have islands like that anymore because they were seen as the primitive or the superstitious, actually. So actually, and I actually looked through the archives. There was this advertisement on the newspaper. It was called Renaming Competition by the Singapore Tourism Board for Pulau Belakang Mati. First prize, $500. And then the next article, actually, it was a few months later, it says that the seven that thought alike. 7 people actually came out with the name Sentosa. And Sentosa means tranquility, which is complete opposite to that island. And what was quite interesting was that actually later on, in that island actually, is that there was an accident. A ship actually ran into a cable car system. You know, there was a cable car leading from the mainland to the island. And the reason was that the tide was so strong, it pushed the ship the ship was on the broadside, and people died. And up to now, actually, in Singapore, the most amount of drownings actually happened in this Sentosa Island, this Tranquility Island. And at least about 4 people actually drowned in this place. So what's happened is that actually I've been doing some like paddling around the area, and the tide is actually very strong. It's like 4 to 5 knots. So in a sense, actually, the name is not really superstitious. It's actually knowledge, but we just got rid of it, you know. So yeah, that these things happen. And the other thing that was kind of interesting was that because the Malay culture is the oral culture, they don't have writing, and so the way they map is through this thing called pantuns. Pantuns is like a rhyme. Sorry. Okay, I've got to cut. Okay, I'll carry on. Okay. And what's interesting was that there's this other island called Pulau Brani, and then the hydrographer actually said in a very forlorn way, he said that, you know that actually Pulau Brani and Belakang Mati actually rhyme. So actually the way the islands are being remembered is through poetic connections actually. And then the thing is that when we rename these islands, and we're actually breaking these poetic connections. Yeah.
Thank you. No, you were fun. That was fast.
Yeah. One of the things that's coming up, I think, that I would like for you guys to kind of speak on is we talk about, I like what you just said, the poetic connections to these places, but there's also stories of disconnection to sea to place. And I'm wondering, it's going back to something Jaimey said in her introduction, that these issues of movement and displacement and climate change are cultural, and we are developing a culture surrounding these issues, right? Whether it's a culture of let's save the koalas but not care about the children, or a culture of, well, we'll just move, right? And all of your work, from what I know of all of your work, is deeply community engaged. What is the culture of climate change that we're seeing in our communities today? And how are you using your work to kind of address that? That mentality of whether people are connected or disconnected, and I don't know if that's making sense.
I mean, we can all talk about it. So I guess I'm thinking about the culture of climate change in our community in the Marshalls. I think there doesn't exist a specific culture yet. And so that's why, Jojium was so important to me, our nonprofit, because right now most of the climate change conversations are happening at a national level. And so it's between the state representatives and those who are engaged in the work of climate change. But even then, they're separated from the rest of the sectors. And so we're having our first climate change and health dialogue at the end of next week when I go back, basically. We're having our first climate change and health dialogue. And it's really our first time to engage on health issues, because we saw an outbreak of dengue fever that was over like 1,000 cases of dengue in the Marshalls alone. And obviously we know dengue and other illnesses, mosquito-borne illnesses, are related to climate change. And so what we try to. So the Secretary of Health was very clear that we need to be a lot more clear in our discussions on climate change, that health is going to be a huge role in a huge impact of climate change. So all that to say, at the national level, it's only one specific office, the Office of Climate Change, that's very deeply engaged in understanding the climate issues. But when we had our national climate change dialogue between the government and directors from each of the other departments and sectors, it was clear that nobody really understood what climate change was. We were still explaining the difference between mitigation and adaptation. And these were to government directors, and they were like, we don't understand what this means that we're switching from mitigation to adaptation. What does this imply to us? And so that's at the national level. Now on the ground level, for us within our nonprofit, we do a lot of community programming that's a much smaller scale, where we're doing photography workshops like Joya did when she came out. We've done climate change arts camps. We've done poetry workshops, we've done digital storytelling, and these are all very small programs, short programs with just our youth. And usually we always start our trainings by getting them to first talk about, what do you know about climate change? So we never enter the room by saying, this is what climate change is, and throwing a bunch of jargon at them. It's all about finding out where they stand first, and especially with the youth, and say, what do you know already? And it turns out they know a lot, but they're always very insecure about what they know. They don't think it's official enough, or it's not the right terminology, and they don't know the scientific basis of it, but they see the tides that have come in. They see the erosion that's eroded the places they used to play at. We used to be able to play volleyball there all the time, and now it's just all water. They'll say things like that, and it's like, yeah, that's exactly what's happening, and you know and experience it already, and you're experts in your own way of experiencing climate change. You don't need us to necessarily tell you, but what we'll tell you is what's happening at the national level and what the government is planning to do, so you're engaged in understanding what's happening to your entire nation. And so for me, I think the pushback that we see coming from our own community is that there's a lot of tension with people feeling as though not understanding why these government officials are flying all over the world talking about climate change, and they see it as, you're just joyriding. You're just joyriding, and you're going on these fancy trips, and who are you to speak on climate change in the Pacific? Like, who are you to speak on cultural issues? Then it becomes a little bit more of like gatekeeping and figuring out who's the right representative for that issue. And I get that a lot too, as someone who grew up in Hawaii and who didn't grow up in the Marshalls. So I've had that kind of pushback and that kind of critique of, why do you get to talk about this issue? But what they don't understand a lot of times is that in these international meetings, they're, first of all, really not fun. Like, at all. You might be in these super exotic places, but they're exhausting meetings where, little to no Pacific representation, or we're getting silenced or tokenized the entire time. And it's incredibly humiliating in a lot of these spaces to be basically begging for survival through negotiations and through a process that's dehumanizing on a very deep spiritual level for us as islanders. And yet we have to do it, because at the end of the day, 0.0001% of global emissions comes from the Marshall Islands. International realm has to be engaged. We have to push back on these bigger countries. And so I see these connections between the international, the national, and the local. And so that's kind of, for me, that's the culture that I engage with, and that's what I've seen from my work so far. Yeah. It's up to you guys.
Okay, well, we're mindful of time and the fact that there's going to be a second discussion, but I think you've all given us a lot to chew on. Maybe we can open this up to our audience who may have questions or comments for any of our panelists or anything that's been raised so far, or if you have something new to raise. Questions? Yes. Very important question, right? What can we do? If anybody has responses.
I get asked that quite often, so I'll take that. So basically, I just saw my child running through the space. So I'm basically, it's okay, someone's looking after. Thanks, Liz. So basically, I would always say, if there's ways in which you can look at your own, I know this is kind of tough, but carbon footprint, and also looking at ways in which you can minimize your own individual actions. But at the end of the day, there's only part of it. There's a huge camp of discussions and debates. If you look on climate and environmental Twitter specifically, there's this huge back and forth between folks who think that, who are all gung-ho about banning plastic straws and banning, plastics, single-use plastics. I think that's valid. For us in the Marshalls, that's actually the campaign we're working on, because we're such a small island nation that it's hard to ignore the plastic waste. It's everywhere. It's such a small space. Waste takes up space. But at the same time, they advocate for that kind of that's kind of single action, or or what's the word? It's personal actions, and then they don't advocate for movement or for like, you know, demanding systemic change. And that's what we really need, is that we need more people to join the climate movement, to be a part of those marches, to voice their opinions, to put pressure on, as a consumer, on big businesses to change their practices, because I think there is a lot of power in the consumer and in these demands and also in these movements. And that's what we've seen from the youth climate change movement in particular, is that it's actually making a huge impact, right? And so I think that whenever people ask, what can we do? I always say, you know, obviously we have our day-to-day lives. You got to live your life. You got to do what you got to do. But if there's opportunities for you to engage in climate discussions, to push back on, you know, climate deniers, to be participating in these bigger marches and these bigger spaces, then definitely take part in that. That's a part to begin with. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Sorry, I always like to go after. I'll just try to make it fast. Basically, I'll tell a quick story. I was at Yale Law School once, and it was a supposedly fabulous panel about climate change. And it was massive, monumental, epically big things, right? Because Yale Law School had a clinic, and they had been assisting to a large extent with Palau's 2011 initiative to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change, right? So it was a great talk. It was 4 hours long, and we were in deep, right, I thought. And then it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then something else happened at the very end of the conference, and it started with a question like that, just like that. What can we do? And I saw the whole 4 hours just disintegrate before my eyes. And then it ended up being so small. I mean, my God, the asks, the level that we got to. So the entire thing went up in smoke, and then it became this odd conversation about recycling at home in your office, and plastic straws over here. And it was wildly tiny. And it happened so fast because I guess like that's part of what neoliberalism does, right? This idea that we can combat climate change as individuals, you know? But we need that. We need the deep structural systemic change, you know? But it's hard to carry that monkey on our backs, right? But it gets lighter if more and more of us carry it. You know, it's just sharing the moral burden of staying present and being sophisticated enough to know that not every conversation that feels big and it's about a big problem, like a global problem, and it's going to be solved by individual, tiny, consumeristic sort of like oriented solutions. This is a global problem, and it requires a global solution, and we have to be sophisticated enough to not allow these conversations to sort of disintegrate, you know, to evolve into just tiny individual choices. Like, we have to be better. I mean, and certain countries are much obviously more responsible because of their historic contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Certain countries, like, you know, need to be held way more accountable. Certain administrations that get involved. So we need to just be able to stay in that conversation and do the opposite. It's not the think global, act local, but think global, act local, and global. It's just that we got to do it all, and it's kind of crazy, and it's a lot of work, but we have to kind of be able to do that. Otherwise, you know, it's just going to be tiny little individual efforts, just tiny voices and prayers that we're throwing to the sky, you know? Yeah.
I just want to jump on that. Green capitalism is not going to save you. Okay? And contrary to popular belief, a corporation is not a person. But we do need to hold that person, that corporate body, accountable, right? So I think that this idea of like, they love to push it back on us. They love to push it back. I was like, it's not about my metal straw. It is so not. It has never been. Same way they wanted to always put the recycling centers in our poor neighborhoods, right? And really, they were setting things on fire, right? So let's just get real, right? It is a much bigger issue, and I am definitely all about holding corporations and governments and the military accountable for their shit. Let's stop pretending that it just boils down to us. Of course, I am part of the big body, right? But I am accountable to I'm accountable to 400,000 ancestors. That's a lot more people that I have a weight to. Corporations are small, okay? Corporations are small. So we need to stop this whole let's bring it down to the individual. That's a capitalist argument. And I'm not even anywhere close to that, right? I start from the earth first, and then we go from there. I start from my ancestors first, and we go from there. Right?
I don't know. Yeah, I think I totally agree. And that's the case that I experience actually from where I'm from. You know, it's like once people leave the water, and you know, it's like, and you know, the military and the corporates, they just take over that space. And I find it problematic actually, because you know, it's that the sea is actually, anyone can survive in the sea. You just need the knowledge actually. You don't have to be a strong, you know, man to be in the sea actually.
Yes.
You're talking, when you said mentioned they, sir, you mentioned them as in Marshallese and Micronesians, or just outsiders? I'm thinking what to. Okay, that's it's a tough one. It's a, yeah. Yeah. I did talk a little bit about my experiences of being Micronesian growing up in the Hawaiian community, and I do feel in Hawaii, and you know, I said specifically local people about the tensions between local and Marshallese and Micronesians. Because I recognize that it's not necessarily just native Hawaiians that have had issues with Micronesians and with the incoming immigrants. For us, I know that back home, there is a waste problem in our islands just as much as there is a waste problem here. And there is, you know, a tension there with an awareness of trash and waste. And maybe that's a part of it, but I don't think that that's really the whole part of it at all. Yeah, do you want to, can you? Yeah, because I'm trying to think it through. I think that I will say that for me, I have wished and hoped that there would be more of a solidarity between Micronesians and Hawaiians, specifically because there is a lot of connections between our communities, between the histories of injustice that we've faced, and the reasons why we're coming here into Hawaii. And I think that there's ways in which we can support the sovereignty movement specifically, and I wish that there was more in our community that could do that. But I also recognize that a lot of us are coming in just with not very much money at all, struggling to make ends meet. A lot of us are immigrants who don't understand that legacy of colonialism or even the word colonialism. Some of us are coming in without that kind of background knowledge. And I do recognize that, there could be more of a dialogue between the two communities. So I think that's something that definitely needs to happen more often. But I think it's a little bit bigger than waste, than the fact that and I think that, yeah, I think I'll stop there, and maybe Julian will be able, I'll do the little alley-oop. Yeah. Alley-oop.
I'll make it fast too. I know we're out of time, but just I keep jumping off of you. But basically, what she's saying is it's more complicated than that. Let's just try to be really specific. For example, as a lawyer, I think one of the biggest problems in the entire conversation about this issue is we are never actually reserving the lion's share of the blame for any of these societal pressures on the proper party. The U.S. federal government is the elephant in the room. I don't think it's one isolated racial or ethnic group in Hawaii. The real issue is the US federal government underfunding communities and governments, because you directed your question at a government, so we can keep it there. The Hawaii government, state government, is wildly, grossly underfunded in terms of compact impact funding. But this is a promise, meaning, it's more than a promise. A promise is unenforceable. This, as a lawyer, is a bargain for exchange. This is a legally enforceable promise. This notion that the US federal government promised Hawaii and where I come from, the Guam government, that they were gonna adequately fund any of these services related to compact impact funding, and it has not. So what I think we need to do is first, before we turn on each other, it's no, you. And it's the US federal government. They're the ones who negotiated these so-called treaties. They're the one not faithfully implementing them in good faith. This is a funding issue in so many respects. And then it ends up being so many more issues. But I think I would urge you and just us all to consider sort of making sure that we're allocating the correct portion of responsibility for any given problem on the proper party.
Thank you. I'm getting a signal from over there, and I think we're running out of time. So I'm going to end by first thanking these fine people up here on the stage who have shared a good amount of their work and their life's journey. And we also want to thank the audience for doing the same and creating this space for listening and sharing. And in the end of the day, I think we can all agree that gatherings like this help us to contest narratives that are deeply in need of contestation, and is going to be our only pathway in addressing the issues that Inundated and other spaces like this create for us. So thank you, all of you, and I'll turn it back over to Jaimey. Thank you.
I think we're in a really great, peaceful space now that the sun has set as well, and that we can hold some space for dealing with the complexity of the emotional issues that are at stake with climate change. And for those of you that were here for the discussion, the first part of the discussion, there were emotional issues that came to the fore, and I think we are dealing with some situations where emotions we're seeing emotions right on the surface and maybe reacting to them, what we can see and feel right here, rather than also seeing how those emotions might be layered in systems and in invisible spaces and forces far away. And so what I would like to do is turn it over to this fine group of wahine to help us in reconnecting communities and environments together. So in putting this panel together, when I was thinking about all of the events that I wanted to take place for Inundation, this one was really special to me because of the four of you, and also Martha Atienza, who couldn't be here tonight. She would have been an amazing voice in this conversation as well. So I am very grateful for your presence here, and also for Mary Babcock for facilitating tonight. Mary is my colleague and friend, and one of the artists in Inundation. She has an amazing process-based practice that has healing as a central part of it. What a lot of people don't know about Mary as well is that she has a degree in psychology as well. And so she comes to her work with a lot of intention, and I think she's a very important person to facilitate this conversation. So thank you, Mary, for doing that.
So I want to thank everybody for being here, filling your bellies, and holding space with us tonight. I also am really excited to have this panel of amazing women in front of us. And I too struggled with the whole bio piece of it, but I chose to bring the bios with me. And the reason for that is we have just this amazing amount of expertise up here, and I would say also an amazing amount of humility. So I wanted to be able to put forth some of the kinds of actions that are already happening out in the world with just these three folks here. So we have the three people on the panel here. Kealoha in the middle, Kealoha Fox. Kealoha is a Native Hawaiian cultural liaison at Aloha Care, a nonprofit health plan in Hawaii, where she oversees organizational initiatives serving Native Hawaiians among the Medicaid and Medicare dual-eligible population across all the islands. Her work utilizes a model of care that values culturally effective public health and medical services, and among many other things, she serves on the advisory committee of the Institute for Climate and Peace, the National Congress of American Indians Climate Action Task Force, and the board of the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. Kealoha is co-author of the books Mana, Lahui, Kanaka, and Haumea, Transforming the Health of Native Hawaiian Women and Empowering Wahine Well-Being, focusing on cultural resilience. She currently works with Vai Vai Collective, creating contemporary spaces and opportunities for healing and community building through co-working and curated programming in urban Honolulu. Thank you, Kealoha. On her left is Kaili Chun, a sculptor and installation artist based here in Hawaii, who has work obviously in the Inundation exhibition. In her work, she addresses containment and exposure, agency and restraint, and creates narratives that illuminate the impact of historical events on the present day. Her diverse training includes receiving her bachelor's in architecture from Princeton University, a master's in fine arts from the University of Hawaii at Mānoa, an apprenticeship with master canoe builder and woodworker, Wright Ele Makule Bauman Sr., and her current enrollment in the Global Track Doctorate in Architecture program at the School of Architecture, University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Ka'ili's innovative and transformative work has received national recognition from the Joan Mitchell Foundation and the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, and has been included in numerous significant exhibitions and collections, both here in Hawaii, in Germany, and across the United States, including, if you look above yourself, this space itself. Her work, Hulale I Kala, an installation for the Prince Waikiki Hotel, brought communities of the hotel, the ancestors and stories specific to place, creating a truly healing environment for the people and the lands of the past, for the people and land living today, and for our future. Thank you, Kali. On my left, Dr. Natalie Kurashima was born and raised in Waipio, Oahu, and currently lives in Haleki'i Kona on Hawaii Island, where she works as the Integrated Resource Manager at Kamehameha Schools, with a kuleana to support community-based stewardship of natural and cultural resources across the Pai'aina of Hawaii. She's worked with various communities on projects on Aina in the realms of traditional agriculture, marine management, cultural site restoration, Aina-based research, and forest stewardship. Currently, she's working with a Ka'upulehu community in Kekaha in North Kona, a community that's the first to form a community-driven 10-year marine rest area in an effort to malama their ancestral Aina. She is part of the Hui, the Ka'upulehu, close, Marine Life Advisory Committee that works to steward the natural and cultural resources of Ka'upulehu Makai. So I want to, first of all, before we sort of work through some questions, just thank these women for the arduous work that they've been doing already, and both in terms of thinking through our past, our present, and our future. So I want to thank all of you. So the title of the panel tonight is Healing Communities and Environments. And when I was thinking about the panel, it really struck me that there was two ways to understand that title. And in one case, healing is an adjective, and the other, it's a verb. So I was really struck by that it could both mean that we're talking about how to heal communities and environments, and we might equally be talking about the communities and environments that actually heal. So I wanted to start with that piece and give each of you just a chance to talk a little bit about, maybe share a little about your role in either or both of these understandings of what our panel is addressing tonight. So we didn't do a mic check. Maybe, we could just pass this around, perhaps. Testing? Yeah. So, Kalohi, do you want to start? I told you, humility is equally large up on the stage.
Maybe if I can invite everyone to start, just by reflecting. I think we had a really powerful panel and incredible leaders that spoke before us, and I just want to hold that space for a moment. So if you can think about one place that is sacred to you, that you feel energized when you go there, it makes you happy when you walk into, and you feel better after going there than you did before. I think if you can just think of that place, when's the last time you went there, even if it was many years ago. Part of the thread that I wanted to bring in from the last panel to ours is that these places that we talk about in the environments that we're bringing forth and that we're calling upon, I think are calling upon us right now. And I think they have asked us to have an intimate and courageous conversation tonight that brings about sometimes really uncomfortable questions, but demonstrates such a need for careful and safe curated conversations like Inundation has done tonight, with the thanks of the sponsors that have brought us together here at Ho'okupu. And so I just want to go back to what Kumu'auli'i had said in his sharing when we encircled up about this place, because if we're going to talk about places and we're going to talk about environments and how those environments need to be healed, but how those environments also heal us, I think we have to really continue to show reverence and honor to this aina here. And so we're in the ili of Ka'akau Kukui, and I can't help but as we feel a sense of tension and the intersect from the last panel, I'm reminded of when I used to work in the government before, and this project across Ala Moana Boulevard was coming up, and just the area that's being gentrified here in urban Honolulu. And there's this tower here, which many of us are familiar with because these are towers that are in the news that are incredibly expensive to purchase for a very small square footage. That tower that's right over there that we're facing right now is called Ai'o. I bring up the word Ai'o because if we're going to talk about places and if we're going to talk about environments and how they heal us, we have to talk about the inoa and the mana that are within these names and the mo'olelo that continue to exist on this aina that we are blessed to stand upon and to have this conversation today, and that I think is requiring us to push ourselves deeper in the way that we connect as a community. I bring up Ai'o because it is a clear example to me of what happens when you have capitalism and you have these extractive and myopic forces that continue to erase our cultures and our peoples and our languages. That name is not Ai'o. That name is Kukulu Ai'o. That is the name of our wind, and that is the name of Ka'akau Kukui, where we are at today. This is the aina of our ali'i and our kahuna lapa'au, that were always fierce and wise healers. That's what Kumu'auli'i was sharing with us today when we encircled up. And so I can't lose space in that moment, in that introduction, that I think when we call upon names like Ko and the places that kahuna like Heva lived, that we are here at today, the ali'i of Kamamalu and these lands from the Mahele in 1848, they are calling upon us to have these conversations now and to weave all of the strengths and solutions that reside in this room together. I believe every answer to all of these questions lies within us and the networks that we generate together. And I think that it's time that we push these conversations forward. And I had just shared with Maxine Burkett, who is the co-founder and the executive director of the Institute for Climate and Peace, where I serve on the advisory committee of. And we are happy and willing to have another conversation like we did, where we brought together community practitioners, community leaders, and community members with our Kofa and our Marshallese and our Micronesian and the Native Hawaiian community and the local Malihini community. We curated a conversation at Kawaiwai. We shared in our cultural foods. We shared stories. We shared art and poems. And I think these are more spaces that we can have. This is exactly the type of work that I've been doing in the one example of how are we identifying contemporary kipuka in urban Honolulu? That's the work that I've been working with Mahina Paishan Duarte and the co-founders of the Vaivai Collective. I see Vaivai Collective, the Institute for Climate and Peace, and this Inundation space here within Ho'okupu. These to me are examples of contemporary kipuka that are here for us to be healed from and to also be a part of the generative network that heals. So I kind of wanted to start there in my introduction and just help bridge the last panel and the conversation into this one.
Thank you. No, go ahead.
Ano ai me ke aloha kākou a pau ma keia wahine o Ka'au Kukui, ma keia makani o Kukulu Ai'o, o Wauno o Natalie, Kurishima, aloha no. So when I think about healing, I I think about my own story. That's the first thing I went to, and I think it bridges, and I think maybe other people can relate to it. Is I grew up on this island in a suburbia place, and it was landscaped with invasive species. I don't think I saw an ohia tree until maybe I was 18 years old. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry. And I also grew up without my kupuna. I didn't have a relationship with my kupuna, and I grew up my whole life knowing, like, you're Hawaiian, going to school with my family, everybody would tell you that, but I didn't know what that meant. Like, I didn't feel like my identity was whole, and I didn't feel like I had that genealogical connection to who I was through my kupuna. And it wasn't until I sat in forests, I breathed in the winds and rains of my place. I learned the names of all the trees of the forest, hiking anywhere. My degree's in botany, even. I'm not a botanist, but learning their names, learning each of those mosses, learning the function of that moss on the forest floor to provide us with water, that has provided our families with water for generations upon generations. That's when I realized that those things are my kupuna. The trees are my kupuna, the snails are my kupuna, this wind has been felt by my kupuna before. And so in that process of learning Aina and truly becoming and being a part of Aina, people in Aina are one, then I feel like I had that internal healing within myself. And so in the work that I do for Kamehameha Schools, that's one of the main parts of my job, is to support communities to manage their own resources, to reconnect people with their places, to have lineal descendants walk the lands of their kupuna, tell the stories of their kupuna, make new stories. We don't always have to tell the same mo'olalo that they told us. We make new stories, we learn new things, and we speak those names and we live them, and that's what, for me, is healing.
Aloha, mai kako, Ka'ili here. And in terms of healing communities, I take a really sort of soft approach in terms of my involvement. I don't think I have, great impact on a lot of the community, but I can try to generate work that embraces community and tries to speak to them a little bit and try to make a connection with certain parts of the community that will bridge land, sea, sky, air with them. And I guess it's through my work that I try to do this, and it's I don't think it's very impactful like what you guys do, but it's an attempt to connect people to their place, to their space, recognizing the ancestral history of place, and having them understand why certain names of places are named that way, and trying to reintegrate or at least offer a space where where all of us can come to understand our ancestral history, our current role in stewarding our physical spaces, and also how we are going to move to the future and embrace our children, our grandchildren, how we're going to introduce them to the genealogy of the land, of the sea, of the sky, and produce hopefully a continuum and a connection and an interconnectedness with now not only Hawaiians but non-Hawaiians as well. I think it's really important that we have these conversations so that we can, I mean, I don't know, we're 20% of the population, 23? So there's that other large demographic that needs to appreciate us as they do the native species of, plants and animals, turtles, monk seals, et cetera, et cetera. There's a certain, it's an interesting kind of conception where, like northwestern Hawaiian Islands are protected, intact, relatively speaking. And, we live here, and as a species, as a native species, we are not necessarily appreciated and valued as our other cousins and, relatives. So healing communities, I think, as only 23% of the population, we need to embrace as well the other portion of the non-native population so that we can create a dialogue, a space to converse, and because our footprint is there together, and so we need to look at each other as a way to move forward and to steward this land, these oceans, these waters, Vaikai, etc., in a way that's going to be beneficial to all.
So in preparing the panel, I also had asked the folks up here to think about some questions they might be interested in sharing together of asking the other panel members. And Natalie, I thought you brought up something really interesting, and I think that'd be a nice next point, which is the idea that the climate and environment here in Hawaii has changed since Hawaii peeked out from under the ocean, from the ocean. And the OEV, the plants, animals, weather, and humans have adjusted to these changes. In what ways can each of you, in the different ways that you're working, embody the resilience of our ancestors in the climate change science, adaptation actions, mitigation measures, and et cetera?
I know that was
Natalie,
my question.
since you asked, you get to start.
That was my question. I should know the answer. Yeah, I think about this a lot because one of the communities that I work with that Mary mentioned, Ko'upulahu in Kekaha, North Kona, it's a very arid place. I think she can show a picture up there. So it's that, yeah, that one. I can see the reflection. It's that rocky one on the right. The landscape looks like that, and it's actually super interesting. So that's Auntie Leia and Auntie Hannah, Auntie Leigh Leitner and Auntie Hannah. They're lineal descendants, and they're standing next to like an archaeological site, and there's like a river-worn stone, or a more, it's not river-worn, it's just worn because there's no rivers in Kona. And then there's like kind of some beat-out lava that you can see. That was a working station where they would beat their kupuna would beat out rocks, and that would be the building blocks of all of their hale, any of their shelters, and that is a rough environment to live in. That to me, they've taught me a lot. Their hualalai erupted in the 1800s twice. Super bombastic flow covered many parts of Kona. Tsunamis have happened, and they tell these stories that this has always happened. We are people of the lava lands. We are people of Kekaha, and this climate change is just another part of being nimble. Auntie Hannah always says nimble. Being able to bounce back. That's like the definition of resilience, right? To be able to bounce back from disturbances and keep your social function, and this community has been doing that for, I don't know, as long as people have been in that ahupua'a of Ku'ulupulahu. And so, like, to me, they embody everything that's happening on their landscape. And a lot of the things maybe we've never seen some of these changes before in our life, the things that we're expected to see we are seeing with climate change, we're expected to see more of. But our kupuna did it in the past. They have dealt with crazy things, and you just learn from it and move on. And I don't know. I don't know the answer to my own question, but I just see it embodied in these kupuna, and those are the stories they pass down to their keiki and their mo'opuna of that inner resilience, and then the resilience within their community and how they share food, stories, anything, time, to make sure that they remain resilient no matter what changes happen on the Aina. Maybe you can come back to me after. I'll have a better answer.
No, go ahead.
So maybe just thinking of ways or stories that embody the kind of resilience that we've seen in our ancestors, present-day stories, either in your own work or communities you come against, or come with, I should say.
Yeah, so I think, in my opening, I went with joy on that soapbox of storytelling. I think when I think about healing work in my training in the Oihana Mauliola and our traditional Hawaiian medicinal practices that I trained in my family and then was invited to train under other kumu as I developed and acquired these skills over time. One of the greatest lessons and stories in working with these really just wise olohe and haku is the power in our healing, in our traditions, is so advanced in our ability to observe and assess and diagnose and to come up with a real integrated treatment plan that our physical, spiritual, emotional, mental health is really reliant on the health of the environment, right? So if the Aina is sick, then the people are sick. If we're sick as Kanaka, then we are gonna make the land and the natural resources sick as well. And so one of the greatest threads of teaching, for half of my life I've been training in one of our Oihana Mauliola practices of Ho'oponopono. In that the wisdom of our ancestors in coming up with these treatment plans is so that we know what mistakes we shouldn't be repeating anymore. We know how we got sick in the first place, and that we can carry on a state of ola, right? To reach that quality of mauliola where we're thriving, not just living, right? Kathy talks about that in her work. And I sit in meetings and hearings sometimes, and I think just what that thread of wisdom has anchored me with for these many years, I wish could come into these meetings and these hearings and conversations where many times I hear decision makers and other powerful leaders repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again. And there's so many times where I'm in these spaces and I just think to myself, we need our healing traditions now more than ever. And not just those healing traditions that are interpersonal, right? That ho'oponopono where we can restore and rebalance and repair relationships between kin, right? It's our ability to be pono with one another and to be pono with the Aina itself. And I think that that's how far we've come and why in certain places, particularly in the context of Hawaii and the Pacific, we're seeing such a galvanizing support around women, around youth, and around indigenous people, because we're imprinted with this knowledge that we're no longer going to sit around and have these meetings and these hearings where we're repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again. That's that ancestral wisdom that's imprinted into us. And when Joy called forth her kuleana, I think it's that same kuleana that reminds us in those meetings where my legs kind of tap and I get my RBF face and I'm just like, you know what? It's that kuleana that's calling from my na'au that says, I am I'm not going to sit here and be a part of another conversation that minimizes us to a plastic straw again, when what we're talking about is actually these massive systemic forces around militarism, capitalism, and urbanization and colonization, lots of the shuns, segregation and discrimination, right? And so I think when I get to, I'm very lucky that I was also trained in Western traditions and contemporary sciences in biomedicine. I'm really lucky to sit here next to one of my favorite Hawaiian scientists that I feel like we got to grow up a little bit together. And then kind of embraced by these two amazing artists and their work, because one thing that I really look to you and your gifts and your power from the stories that you bring through your form is your ability to tap into the senses and your observation and your ways of knowing, and then you bring it out in these real demonstrative, visible ways that each of us can look at and just say, yes, like that is what I was trying to say, and I just couldn't say it in that moment or in that meeting. And it's when you're driving home and you're like, that's what I wanted to say. I feel like that's the gift of the work. When we have intersectional conversations with art and climate and justice, and then how do we also really center, I think, in a lot of the conversations that came out from the first panel, how are we also centering conversations around equity and justice and racial healing? So for me, I can't help but notice and bring forth, so today is the National Day of Racial Healing. Like, there's another reason why I think we're having these conversations and why these times are also really convergent and really intersectional to the work that we're doing. And how do we look to the future in this new year, in this new decade that we just started just a few, days ago?
Well, I guess, I'm interested in my own kind of work of how we integrate and intersect and interconnect all of these aspects of life, living, ancestral practice in an urbanized world, right? It's I don't know. I don't have those answers. How do we intersect not only with our own people, but non-Hawaiians in this pretty global society, and grounding yourself in land. I was thinking about this panel, and one thing that is very different for me is that this land smells very different now. And it used to smell a certain way, and now it doesn't. And it's like, whoa, what happened there? I walk down Chinatown, and all I can smell is urine and feces. And this used to smell amazing. And so that, to me, is the breath of the land. It kind of has, my mentor was Wright Bowman Sr. His father had the 5th car on the island of Hawaii. And we don't know anything else but cars now. Yeah. And so there are so many layers to kukuluai'o. That and this and us and how do we mitigate this? How do we, because we need to. There's no other way for us to handle the situation except to become involved participants in solutions, in ways that we can change a superficial application of pattern language, to a building or color or that sort of thing. It stems from the land, it stems from the ocean, it stems from the sky, and we really need to have a serious conversation about how we're going to reconnect and interconnect all these aspects of 21st century living, you know, in this ancient land. I don't have those answers, right? But we need to negotiate the ancestral and the contemporary as well. And I think that's sometimes difficult. I think it's maybe easier in art, you know, where we can use that language or these materials to address certain aspects of one or the other or a combination of both. But it's difficult, it's hard work, and every aspect, everyone involved here, it's difficult because we don't want to offend, and then we don't want to also, we want to make it a productive kind of, you know, relation. And I think, you know, that's a kind of weird, kind of funky, you know, place to be to a certain extent. And we can have certain conversations with our family, we can have certain conversations with Hawaiians, but you cannot say certain things, you know, with non-Hawaiians, you know, lest they be offended. And so, I don't know, I have no answers, but this is part of, I think, for at least for me, the pursuit of my work is to kind of look at those channels and trying to navigate in a way so that we can be productive, so that we can help our people, so that we can serve our people. Yeah, I mean, that for me is the most important thing, and it's serving our people, Hawaiian, non-Hawaiian as well, and figuring out a way, you know, to, with those that have major egos, to trying to, you know, okay, you have to negotiate them in a way that you can be productive and not just, you know, kind of clash, because that most often ends up being non-productive for our people. Yeah.
So, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, so I'm in a traditional learning school, like a halau, it's called Halau Ohia. So it's a traditional learning school with Auntie Ke Kuhi, Keali'i Kanako Oleo Haili Lani. And it's targeted at conservation professionals. So there's like people from DLNR, people from DHHL, KS, everybody who manages land in Hawaii is somehow connected to Halau Ohia and this conservation world. And so many are non-Hawaiian, some are Hawaiian. But the first day, no introductions. There's no title, there's no name, there's no nothing. Like you don't even say your name till, I don't even know when we said our names. It was more like, what's your favorite plant person? Like who do you connect, what plant do you connect to? And you kind of remember that, and then, and so you're all on that same playing field. And then the way we learned how to introduce ourselves is by your mauna. So you're, o mauna loa ku'u mauna. That is my mauna. That is the substrate that I live on. That's the substrate that feeds me. And so whether you're Hawaiian or not, Mauna Loa, and if you live on the substrate of Mauna Loa, you are biophysically part of Mauna Loa. That water trickles through those rocks and you ingest it, and you are built of the cell. Your cells are built of Mauna Loa. And so it matters if you live in Hawaii. If you live in Hawaii, you are Hawaii. You drink of these waters. So you should know the name of your mauna. You should know the name of, we had to do, o hualalai me mauna loa ku'u mau mauna, and then you say the winds, your winds or your rains. So ka'eka, ke kaiopua me ke kehau ku'u mau ua makani. And then you can say your kai, where you get your food from the ocean, o kainaliu ku'u kai. And you can say the vau you live, you can say your ahupua'a, you can say your moku, and all of those things sustain you. And all of those are true to us on a human level. And then it makes you realize, like when you're saying that, it's like those are my kupuna. Like that Mauna Loa is my kupuna. It feeds me every single day. That vai that comes down from the sky feeds me every day. And this is also applicable in an urban situation. You have to know where your water comes from. That's just something that everybody should know. And when's the last time, in Oahu, it's there. Water comes from somewhere, and there are maps of every single bay that was named for this coastline. Every 100 feet has a name. And so when you honor it, and we don't know it. And so this is a good exercise that anybody can do. It's super simple. And it was really like a gem that she taught us in this way. And it was really equalizing on a lot of levels, because these are people we go to we work in the boardroom with them. We're gonna go make decisions about Aina that has effects across the whole state. These are our regulators, but they know now that the name of their po'oi, and they know their winds and their rains, and I think they think about them as ancestors and not as just like turning on the faucet anymore.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open it up for audience questions. I think we're actually already talking about it, but we've been using the word healing like we all know what that means, and as if it means one thing, right? So I'm wondering if you could just say briefly what you think, how you understand healing and that process of healing.
So I always think about the dualism between healing and then being healed, and that process is actually really synchronous, right? So whether you go into a clinical psychology program or a medical profession, or you go into a traditional healing space, because I've actively trained in all three of those environments, it's really unique because the requirements of being trained in those fora mean that you also have to go through a process of healing yourself as well. That everybody comes into these professions with some type of violence, abuse, and trauma. Sometimes they're more proximal, like they recently happened. Sometimes they're something that happened to us or within our nuclear family, and sometimes they're more distal, right? They happened intergenerationally, historically in the past, and maybe it happened to your community rather than within your family. No matter what, there are still processes that you have to go through to unpack that and understand what you were bringing when you were required to heal and treat and bring well-being to others. So when I think of healing, I always think of it being really synchronous and really plural. Being healed, for me, and the work that I do requires a lot of commitment and strength, and a real honesty with being vulnerable to the powers of healing that come through you. So there are these protocols and activities that you can do, whether you go into Western medicine or traditional medicine or something integrative in between, right? Where what's powerful about when you're being healed is it's not an act that you do in isolation. It's not something that you do alone. It requires that faith in somebody else or some higher power or some greater sense and state of wellness that I always really try to think about. And I think that's really critical to the conversations we're having around climate justice, is the actions that we take and the solutions that we're seeking are not going to come in isolation, and they require us to have that synchronous symbiotic relationship of what it means to be a healer and to also be healed. And so that's really where I approach it from, in terms of that training and that background and really that ideology and the orientation that I bring to my work with my clients and my patients and the students that I'm training.
Thank you.
I guess healing for me means serving. It's a way. There are many different ways to serve, and it's, I don't know, whether you are creating something that's speaking to a particular issue, or commenting on a situation, creating a forum and, a place for people to come to and, situate themselves and try to understand each other, I think is a very important aspect of that. And if I can serve those to bring them together in that place, then I think that is a part of the healing process. To be healed for me is the ocean. That's where I go. Anytime I'm in the ocean, that's my happiest. That's where I find joy. That's where I find peace, and that's where I find humility as well, because you know that you are such a tiny, tiny part of this world when you go out there. And so for me, the Aina is the ocean as well. And so it's this,
For me, I guess when I hear the word healing, I thought of pono. And I think a lot of times, in the in the classroom values, it says pono, righteousness. But then I think pono is about balance. Pono is, and I think about that on like the interpersonal level. So, if you're out of whack, physically, spiritually, like you feel that unbalance, and sometimes there's certain things that put you back in whack and put you back in pono. And for me, that's like walking in the forest, just like focusing on that relationship, and then like on a wait, did I say inter? Wait, what's inter? This is inter and intra. And then on an intrapersonal level, like when you think about the Hawaiian process of ho'oponopono, it's about, a relationship that's out of whack. And you bring that, you come to agreement through maybe days of talking, through a process, through a ritual. It was explained to me as a ritual, where you are pono again. You make it, you ho'oponopono, you make pono. And then when I think about like the work we do on Aina, resource management, everything's always out of balance. We like right now, there's we're never at a place where it's like, yes, this forest is doing amazing. It's like constant battle for invasive species, for money, for fencing, for we have ungulates, drought, like fire, and all of those things are constantly happening, and you're never going to get it to a place that it was in the past. That's never going to happen. But you can get it to a place where it's balanced, where it's pono, and where Aina doesn't even need you anymore. That would be like the end state, is where it can be balanced on its own, and you don't need to have intervention. So that's what I think about, those different levels of pono. And maybe there's a regional pono and a global pono. Oh, the global pono is hard. Yeah.
That's what we're here for, right? So how about some questions for the audience for our panel? Yes. Lala.
It's been healing for me to be able to listen to the work and background and Ike that you're sharing. I'm coming from a place of recently joining the City and County Office of Climate Change for Honolulu as the Climate Resilience and Equity Manager. And I've never worked in government, and my background has always been in private sector, specifically tourism, and place-based community development the past 10 years since I came home. What I hear and what I'm able to learn from this conversation, and so many that our communities are having, resonates so deeply to my cellular level. It makes so much sense, almost common sense. But there's a separation within understanding in our contemporary government and private sectors or capitalistic systems. There's, sorry to be so long-winded, but I guess my question is, how can we incept, how can we lovingly disrupt the current systems that don't necessarily get this in that way? If you could share some examples or experiences you've had in dealing with those seemingly clashing of cosmologies. Mahalo. Kalamai for being so long.
Okay. It's super hard. I work for part-time architecture firm. And so, you know, we are part and parcel of building these buildings, designing, you know, these spaces and places. And you really need a complete holistic approach to the project. So I'm talking about building buildings here, you know, in Ala Moana, Waikiki, Kaka'ako, specifically. And it becomes very difficult a lot of the time to start from the place, you know, the name of the place, so that we can create and design an urban living situation that integrates the ancestral history of the place, that embraces the present day needs of our people, not necessarily people who are going to come in here and live for 2 weeks and then leave. And how is that impact, you know, going to affect, you know, the watershed from Mauka to Makai? We're dealing with, that's why I have a difficult time understanding, you know, and understanding my role in it, because you have so many different stakeholders in this project, in these projects, in these developments, that, you know, is basically capital driven. So, right? But they all want to be authentically Hawaiian. How do you bridge that? Do you? You know? I mean, do we keep putting sand back in Waikiki? Do we let the water come in? And that was one of my questions, is if we let the water in, how do we do that? Right? I mean, there's a lot at stake. This particular area here is the main economic driver of the whole state. So there's a lot to think about. It's so complicated. It's not an easy answer. And being in the field of architecture and art, you know, art is one thing. Architecture, when you're actually impacting, you know, a space for at least 50 or 100 years, that's an investment. And that, you know, when you're working on a speed like this, when somebody wants a return on their investment, it's not necessarily going to happen, yeah? And so when you're in your meetings, I mean, we're in the position to impact that, but, you know, how much, right? To what degree? That's a difficult question, Lala. Yeah, no, but a necessary question, because we go into these meetings thinking about that all the time, right? So, okay, sorry.
I'll give maybe a little bit more of what personally helped me in the 10 years that I was in the government, and now work to defend Medicaid and Medicare, and am actively working to restore Medicaid benefits that have been removed for COFA migrants that they used to have and now no longer do. That's the space that I'm working in now, but don't currently work in the government like I did. There's always an opportunity, especially in the office that you work in with the time that you folks have left. What you folks have passed into law is the best place to start. When we have an opportunity to do administrative rulemaking, when hearings come up, people need to go out and they need to show up. Our expertise needs to be written in testimony and also delivered in person orally. We have to do both, and we have to get everybody that needs to be there that are constituents for those representatives and those senators and those elected and appointed officials in the room when we need them. I have seen it work. I worked with an amazing, young, just like bright team, and we were just passing bill after bill after bill. And one of the best things that we did is that we came together and everybody brought their gifts around the table, and we started seeing where the gaps were, and we started seeing what can we put into the SOPs, what can we amend in this law. It's not always about introducing something new. Sometimes it's enforcing what's already been passed. And that's also one of the greatest gifts that you have in being in the government, whether you're at the county, the state, the federal, or the international level. Enforcing what's already on the books is something that we continue to have to do. At the same time, we have to amend and modify bad policy, and we have to introduce new policies that we can get passed that we know we need now, so people stop talking about our grandchildren in the future. We're talking about right now for these climate justice actions that are really needed. And then, just really the last thing I'll say is that we really need to vote. Every single person needs to vote this year at the presidential election, our local elections, our state elections, both in the primaries and the general. And we really need people to run for office. And those people that are ready to run for office need to be supported in a lot of different ways. That includes a lot of energy and money put into them, and we also need to help them raise funds so that they can also campaign in the areas that they need to so that they can win.
I think it's super important to get like-minded people with similar worldviews and positions of power in these places, and people that will advocate for our positions and in the decision-making seats. And I've seen this work, or I feel like it's working a little bit in conservation. Maybe like 25 years ago, there was like no local or Hawaiian people in conservation. There was no mention of the importance of community management and conservation. There was no mention of the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and ancestral knowledge in conservation in Malama Aina. And now with programs like the PIPES internship, Kupu, there is a critical mass of like young Kama'aina and like-minded individuals because of training programs like Halau Ohia, that maybe they're not from Hawaii, but they are trained in this system of thinking and they are in positions of power. So it's kind of like both ways. And so now, like at these meetings, maybe I'll be the only like Kama'aina or Hawaiian in a lot of these meetings still, but I think it's like on the cusp of making a difference, where so many people are getting their PhDs or having like these really great management experiences and launching into those positions of power, like Kaleo, Manuel. And I think it's really making a difference in some of the decisions that are getting made, and some of just the pause before you make a decision to like think about the community, think about who you live with, think about what the repercussions of this is 7 generations from now. So for me, and I feel like I've seen it at the university. When I didn't graduate that long ago from grad school, but in graduate school I was in the Department of Botany, and there was no locals or Hawaiian professors in any of the natural sciences. So it's like the people who are teaching Hawaiian ethnobotany, like that's not, like we should have someone who knows that, teaching that. And there's the cluster hire, and so there's a lot of changes at the university now, many cluster hires, but there still isn't a local or Hawaiian professor in botany. So there's a lot of, like, there's still a lot of ways to go. And it's, my friend that works at the county now, he said, working at government's like turning a ship, like, you turn, and then 10 years later it turns. So it's a difficult bureaucracy to expect quick change in.
Other questions?
Yes.
Aloha. Just wanted to say that sometimes in the maturity process, you can go from swinging away against establishment and trying to work on movements to the evolution of working on yourself. And so to incorporate your question, and as a gift to the panel, I kind of put together a little poem that I tried to incorporate what you folks were saying, since it's about healing. Myopically extracted the excavation of evolutionary existence, searching for wholeness, healing bridges of belonging in winds of displacement, forests of nurtured learning, integrating planetary senses, softening impacts in artistic embraces, spatial consciousness, multidimensional introductions to interconnective continuums of eternal collectives, nimbler nuances guiding practitioners' advancements, wisdom's treatment in dynamic pictures, reparations in relations, galvanizing galactic imprints, pico persuasions, feeling forward in cellular splurging, intersectional stimulations, demonstrative participation, grounded determination in breath's provocation, global inundation involving intricate investigation, ancestral archival of ascension, navigational channels of reciprocity, feeding soulful maturity, synchronized simplicities, unraveling pluralities, vulnerabilities, honesty, and relationship in divinity.
You just wrote that right now? Wow. Wow. I don't know what? Nice. Wow. So I think that right there says something about the power of these collective spaces and these spaces with really rich histories and the mana from all the different factors coming in, the winds and the land and the waters here, and our collective being together in this evening with the panel prior to this and this panel as well. I don't think we could end this panel in a better way, so I'm going to, at this point, hand it back over to Jaimey.
I don't think I can end this panel in a better way. Thank you so much for your poem, and you poetically engaged with something that I was hearing as well, which is that we have to look at from multiple scales, right? It's about multiple scales. It's not just about the individual or the global, the systemic. It's also about the community. And the community of humans and more than humans and elemental forces and all of those things coming together. The other thing that your poem really brought out, I think, is how much this is a difficult process of, as you say, activist work and self-work, all of those things intermingling, interconnecting together. So let's just continue the process outside of this space. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this really long conversation, but I think it was important to get deep and to have these hours together. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you to this space, too.